These off seasons are long for Ohio State fans when expectations are not met, but they certainly are not dull, especially in this day and age. We got Pat Murphy here from Bucknuts 247 Sports. Join Pat right there, breaking down Ohio State football every day, basketball season as well. Pat, how you doing today?
I'm good. How you doing, Mark?
I'm doing just fine. Good to see you. Have you back on here.
Yeah.
And the season ended in not the way that everyone had wanted or expected, but there is so much to go through. And of course, the huge news that took some by surprise, but not necessarily everyone, was Kyle McCord in the transfer portal. A few times have we seen, well, he might be at the top of the list, a quarterback who has succeeded, at least in regards to a win-loss record at a school like this, then hit the transfer portal. I don't know. He might be the guy under these circumstances to make this decision.
Certainly an interesting one. And we've seen guys, multi-year starters like a Sam Hartman last year, who I think started. That was kind of a surprise when some of those guys moved on. This is just kind of the way of college football, I think, and we're going to see more of this going forward. Look, from my understanding, when Kyle McCord met with Ryan Day, or however the situation was, Ryan Day was not going to guarantee that Kyle was going to be the starter going into the 2024 season. And I think that's fair. Kyle played really well by some standards, but at Ohio State, the level is Heisman Trophy level quarterback that gets the team to the college football playoff. And so Kyle was not that. Now, could he get there next year? Maybe. But I think Day realized that you've got two other good quarterbacks on the roster, another one coming in January, and you had to see what you could get in order to maximize your offense. This is an offense that was good this year, but not great, despite having some big name stars on the offense. And that wasn't all on McCord, but you've got to figure out. And frankly, I think there will be a number of positions, even with some returning starters, maybe even on the offensive line, where there will be competitions and where in other years there may not have been. So I think it was presented to McCord that, you can stay here and we'd love to have you stay here and compete for this job and try and get better. And he looked at it, and I'm sure his family was involved here, and thought, okay, well, I have 2 years of eligibility remaining, but really I'd like to play one more year and hopefully move on to the NFL. And I'd like to do it at some place where I know I'm going to be the starting quarterback. And look, I think Kyle McCord could go to a lot of different schools and put up some really good numbers and, position himself. I don't know where, it'll depend on what he does, but position himself to be drafted next year in the NFL and kind of live out that dream. And this is, again, like I said, I think this is kind of the way things are going to go. You're going to see this wave of, transfer portal. It's almost free agency. We have this a lot with the NBA in the summer. You started to see it now in the NFL. Guys making these moves, sometimes surprisingly, and college football now has its own version of that with this 30-day transfer window here right after the regular season. And I think Kyle McCord will be the first of quarterbacks that maybe don't have the year that they expected and, move on with, some eyebrows raised a little bit. And we'll see. I think if Kyle McCord goes somewhere and can play really well and other quarterbacks see that, hey, look, if there's that opportunity, you could go take it. Now, if Kyle McCord goes somewhere and struggles and it's then the question's, well, why didn't you stay at Ohio State? Maybe other players think twice about it. But I think we're in a new world of college football, and these type of things that didn't happen before have started to become more of the norm.
As you mentioned, he had the 13th rated passer rating in college football this past season. And maybe prior to this run of Dwayne Haskins, Justin Fields, and CJ Stroud, maybe that is looked upon differently than it is today. And I know that he's not a running quarterback, so he doesn't have that Braxton Miller, JT Barrett component that supplements the passing skills. So it's just strictly, does he deliver as a passer? So it is difficult from that standpoint. But then there's all sorts of thoughts about what they would have done with a transfer quarterback coming in and what that competition would have looked like and how pleased or not so pleased Ryan Day was with Kyle McCord's progress. But the other thing to be noted, you see this long list of pretty notable quarterbacks in the transfer portal. He, I believe, is the only guy that I can think of, and I've scoured this list a number of times, is just a one-year starter, where the rest of these guys are 3 and 4 year starters with so much more experience than he has. So nobody should be shocked next year if he gets into the right system with a good quarterback developer and somebody that knows how to call plays to fit him and develop an offense around him, that he doesn't take off to a certain extent.
Yeah. And look, I've said this throughout the season. I think Kyle had what most places would consider a really good first year as a starting quarterback. I've used the example a few times. You go look at Bo Nix, his first year as a starter. Look at Michael Penix Jr. and these guys that are now Heisman Trophy finalists. Someone pointed out to me Joe Burrow's numbers when he transferred to LSU that first year were nothing like they were his second year as a starter. Now, different situation with all those guys. They were transferring. They hadn't all been in the program. But we'll see. I think Kyle showed at times this year how good he can be. It's not an arm talent problem. It is learning to read the defense better, footwork, those type of things that I kept saying, on shows like this or on our message boards at Bucknuts. These are things that Ryan Day can work with this kid on and get better at throughout the offseason. Obviously, that's not going to happen now. But, yeah, I think if you are Kyle McCord, you now have an opportunity to go kind of show everyone what you can be, and maybe do it at a place where the pressure isn't as amped up as it is at Ohio State. And that's not to say he couldn't handle the pressure at Ohio State. I thought he handled it really well this year, and you saw it in some of those bigger games. But, he wants an opportunity to play and not have to worry about a competition. He already went through that. I completely get that. Ryan Day had to make the best decision for Ohio State's offense in terms of we're going to open this thing back up. Kyle McCord had to make the best decision for himself. And, I think the fact that we mentioned 2 of the 3 Heisman Trophy finalist quarterbacks are transfer guys, again, this is just kind of how things are these days.
And now that we're looking at a list that includes about, I guess, at 15 starting quarterbacks at major programs that are in the portal, what are your thoughts concerning whether you know of specific targets or a specific style of target that would fit Ryan Day's offense, or whether they need to go back to a more mobile quarterback? Just your thoughts about what kind of move they may make going forward.
I think it's funny because I remember Ohio State fans towards the end of the JT Barrett era just kind of being done with the mobile guy who couldn't throw it as well. Everybody was enamored with Dwayne Haskins, what he did when he came in against Michigan. And obviously Dwayne did some great stuff. Now, a few years down the line, people want a mobile quarterback again. I know there's a balance there, right? I mean, Justin Fields is probably about as good as you can get when you have a guy who is willing and able to use his legs, but also has a really good arm and understands the, how to make reads and whatnot. It's just funny how we've kind of gone back and forth here. I think Ohio State would certainly be interested in a guy who can do a little bit more movement, whether that be actually picking up yards or even somebody like a Taulia Tagovailoa. Not him, obviously, he's out of eligibility, but a guy who can just keep plays alive a little bit more. CJ Stroud, it didn't get talked about enough, his ability to do that, because people always talked about the fact that he didn't run, but he did move around in the pocket really well. And actually, I thought McCord was decent at that pocket presence before he suffered that ankle injury. From my understanding and people I've talked to, the Buckeyes will do their homework on all of these guys, but there is a sense that because of what is in the program already, you don't necessarily want to bring in a guy who's going to be here multiple years. Now, if you find a fit and you think, okay, this guy is definitely better than what we've got, or at least as good and can compete with Lincoln Kienholz, Aaron Nolan, Devin Brown, if he chooses to stay in the program as well after all this dust settles, then maybe you do that. But I would be less surprised if they go find a guy who could play has 1 year of eligibility left, looking to get into a program where he can win and kind of play on a bigger stage and get to the NFL in a year. And then you have another year with these other quarterbacks in your system, and you can kind of, continue to develop them there. I know Riley Leonard from Duke is a guy whose name has been thrown around. Now he has, I believe I saw visits already scheduled to Notre Dame, and that's kind of further along in the process already because they knew they were losing Sam Hartman. Another name that was mentioned to me was Will Howard out of Kansas State. Neither of those guys put up crazy numbers, but both of them are more athletic and can do some different things. I know obviously people have talked about Cam Ward. I'm not sure that there's a ton of interest on the Ohio State side there. Again, I think they will look into all these situations and see kind of what fits best. But that was my initial understanding, was he was not a guy they were immediately interested in. We'll see how it plays out. But that's kind of the read I got, was if we can find a guy who makes us better next season, maybe a guy who hasn't had a chance to play with the talent of wide receivers that Ohio State has. So you think you automatically elevate him that way. And I think the athleticism thing is certainly a factor too. If you can get somebody who's a little bit more mobile, I think that's kind of the goal. If they could kind of build their own transfer portal quarterback, that would be what they'd be looking at.
We've got Pat Murphy here from Bucknuts 247 Sports, breaking down Ohio State football. Of course, it's the off season, just days, from the championship weekend. And this is when everything hits the fan and all things are going haywire, including, I'm not even going to do the count, 12 or 13 players that have hit the transfer portal. So some people might be concerned about that there's some kind of cultural issue. I don't believe that's the case. It's just the way of college football, and these numbers are pretty similar. This might be a bit of a high number, but still got to realize that a place like Ohio State, they're going to be highly recruited players who then have to wait their turn or don't pan out, but know that they've got a lot of options elsewhere. So I'm not going to go through the list. I'm going to let you, Pat, kind of pick and choose what you think is notable here, because a couple guys stand out to me, certainly.
Julian Fleming is one. Look, he's been at the program for 4 years. It's not been the situation I think he would have envisioned, given the injuries that he's had to go through. I still think Julian Fleming's a really good player. Maybe he's not going to put up 1,000 yards receiving and Marvin Harrison type numbers, but he does a lot of things on the field, blocking, running routes to open things up for other guys that are really important and have been important for Ohio State, especially these last 2 seasons where he's been more healthy. This is a guy who, I think you can find other players who can do those things, but this is a guy who really bought into it. You're going to miss him to some degree. The other couple that I would point out, Kai Stokes was a guy that they were really high on during his freshman year. That one has not worked out like I think anyone would have expected it to, based on how Ohio State coaches were talking about him. We saw him in the spring game have a pretty big performance. Evan Pryor is, another one. Maybe if he doesn't suffer the injury that ended his season in the preseason last year, he's more involved and plays a bigger part these last 2 seasons. I still think he's a guy who's going to help a program at some point. And then Amori Abor, who just officially entered the portal right before we started recording this. I think he announced he was going to last week. This is a guy they were really excited about when they recruited him, I believe out of Texas, defensive end. It just, for one reason or another, and injuries have played a part there again, but it just hasn't panned out the way I think anyone expected it to. Ohio State could lose both of their starting defensive ends, JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer, but they've got Kenyatta Jackson and Caden Curry both back next year. So there wasn't a clear path to a guy who's heading to playing time for a guy who's heading into his 3rd season. And again, I'm just going to keep repeating myself with this transfer stuff. We just got to get used to it. There's no other way to kind of just, to say it. I mean, I think Alabama last year had like 20 players transfer out of the program, and they're back in the college football playoff. So it doesn't, just because you're having a decent number of guys depart, I don't think it necessarily means there's something wrong with your program. These guys just see that there's a path to playing time elsewhere, that there may not be as clear of a path with this program. And so they've got to make the decisions that are best for them.
Appreciate y'all being here at the Voice of College Football. Please hit the like button if you enjoy the content. Join Pat at bucknuts.com. It's on 247 Sports, and subscribe here at the Voice of College Football. And so there's the attrition through the transfer portal. And then, of course, the NFL draft, where you have guys that have run out of eligibility. They're gone. You've got the slam dunk guys that have obviously proven themselves, even though they could come back. And then you've got those borderline guys. Who do you think fits in that category where it's really going to be interesting to see which way they turn?
I think there's a few. We mentioned one already in Jack Sawyer. Had a pretty good end to the season, but statistically, I don't think he ever quite lived up to the 5-star. I think he was the number 2 or number 3 defensive end in the class, with JT Tuimoloau. I think another year would probably do him some good. Obviously, the players look at that differently, right? And you think if there's an opportunity to go make more money in the NFL, a lot of guys tend to take it. Now, that does change with NIL, right? And they are able to make a good amount of money here. And so I think that does factor into a guy like Jack Sawyer's decision. Another one to keep an eye on, I think, is Tyleik Williams. Breakout season at defensive tackle for Ohio State, but could you come back again, NIL money, put together a second consecutive big season and really boost your draft stock and being one of the top defensive tackles in the draft? I think that may be discussions over at the Woody Hayes Athletics Center. A guy like Travion Henderson, what does he do? A third-year guy who obviously coming in, I think, was probably on that 3-year path, but injuries have really affected him. Missed the end of last season, missed some games this season. The numbers have been good, but not great. Obviously, he's an explosive player, but could you come back and maybe prove that you could be more durable and do some of the between the tackle running a bit more? And again, help your draft stock. Now, running backs don't have a long shelf life, and so maybe getting to the NFL as soon as possible is better for him. Cornerback Jordan Hancock, he had a really good season playing mostly in the nickel for Ohio State. Is that enough for a guy for the NFL to believe in a guy like that? And kind of, does he believe that he's shown enough? We had similar conversations when Shaun Wade was playing that kind of slot corner a few years ago. He did end up coming back and actually probably hurt his draft stock by not playing as well at the outside corner spot. So those are probably the guys that I would highlight as guys with like serious decisions to make. Oh, Donovan Jackson too, the offensive lineman, the guard. He came into the season as, really thought of as one of the best guards in the country and had an inconsistent year. He's another guy, I think, 4-year offensive linemen aren't surprising. So if he decided to come back and really try and push for an improved season next year, that would not be surprising either.
Tyleik Williams had a big year. He really flashed, more than flashed, I think. I think he had a really strong season. And Jack Sawyer was a guy that, they seem to have given the opportunity because of the changes in the defense and the change in his assignment to let him be more of a pass rusher, rack up those kind of numbers you talked about, and it didn't necessarily happen for him. So we'll see what he decides coming up. Pat Murphy's here, Bucknuts 247 Sports, breaking down Ohio State football. Saturday's the announcement of the Heisman Trophy. I don't know if Marvin Harrison's the best player in the country, but I will say this, that more than likely he would be the guy that would be mentioned as the best player at his position in a more unanimous fashion than any other player at their position in the country. He's up against 3 quarterbacks, of course. And so here's where we stand with the Heisman Trophy. And it's kind of strange that they produce a Heisman Trophy finalist receiver in a season in which there are critics of Kyle McCord's performance. They obviously go hand in hand. Receiver's the most dependent position on the field. They don't rack up numbers without the ball coming their way. So he was certainly limited in a sense that it wasn't as prolific of an offense it has been in the past, but still racked up enough numbers to get this kind of attention.
Yeah, and I think that probably plays a part in it. And I know there was talk about LSU's Malik Neighbors and Rome Odunze from Washington. You look statistically, they have more catches, more yards than Marvin Harrison Jr. Harrison and Neighbors have the same amount of touchdowns. Odunze's one fewer. But I do think the fact that Harrison came in with the reputation that he did after last season, and then despite what you would consider inferior quarterback play to what he had a year ago with CJ Stroud. The fact that he was often doubled, if not triple teamed in terms of the coverage that he saw. The fact that Emeka Egbuka, Cade Stover, Travion Henderson all missed time with injuries. And so a lot had to be put on Marvin Harrison. And other than the Notre Dame game, when the eyes of the country were on the Buckeyes, Harrison put up big numbers in those games. So I think all of that kind of comes together with, the invitation to New York City for the Heisman Trophy ceremony. It would not surprise me if he finishes fourth in this. And I don't think that that's a disservice to him. We know what the kid is going to be at the next level. He's one of the greatest Ohio State players to come through this program in terms of what he was able to do in just over 2 years, if you count that Rose Bowl performance at the end of his freshman year. So look, when a wide receiver is even invited, and I know we just had one win a few years ago, but it's a pretty big accomplishment. And I think the fact that he is in the mix with three other quarterbacks speaks to kind of what how people view him across the country.
Pat, this program is so incredibly scrutinized. And there was one loss this season. It was to the wrong team in the wrong situation. They were driving the ball down the field, came within 35 yards of pulling off an upset yes, it was technically an upset, but more so of a comeback win against Michigan and being exactly where they want to be. I can imagine. I didn't hear Ryan Day's news conference for the bowl game announcement, but of course, he's going to be hit with the entire offseason, what changes are going to be made. And I'm not talking about necessarily coaching changes or anything that grave, but just this meticulous combing through of everything that they do to make sure that they're doing it to the maximum degree. And, just your thoughts about where this program stands and if there is any systematic issues in what they're doing.
I don't think there's any systematic issues. I think you have a Michigan issue right now. And unfortunately, two of these last 3 years, that's meant you missed out on the college football playoff because of that loss. Obviously, a couple years ago, they also had another loss, but it's been that Michigan game that's kept you out. And there's the importance placed on the Michigan game. And if you're not an Ohio State or Michigan fan, you probably it's hard to explain what that means. You compare it to Auburn and Alabama or some of these other rivalries. That's not the way it's viewed by Ohio State fans. You just can't lose that game. And Ryan Day knows that. So I do think they need to look at that. But also college football is going to change in terms of on the field next year and what wins and losses mean with the expansion of the playoff to 12 teams. And the realignment of these conferences that we're going to see. So, you're almost, if you're a program like Ohio State, coming into the season expecting to be in a 12-team playoff, right? I mean, when has Ohio State not been around that top four at the end of the year? It's been quite a while. So and I wrote about this the other day. Ohio State will have to decide what it wants to be because I think the Buckeyes are built to compete in a college football playoff. We saw that a year ago when they come up 1 point short against Georgia. And maybe that means they're not as built to beat what has been a very physical, rugged Michigan team. Not so much this year because obviously they were right there in that game. But I do think, if you are going to prioritize the Michigan game, then you may have to change the way you do some things because that game's always cold. It's you just play it differently than when you're on the indoor, fast-paced turf of some of these college football playoff venues. So I think the program is in a good spot because if this were a 12-teamer, I think they would be one of the favorites to win a national title, despite that loss to Michigan, even with maybe not the high-level quarterback play that you've come to expect. That one loss still would hurt, no doubt about it. But I do think, like you almost had the chance to do last year, kind of make up for that and make people feel better by playing in a postseason. So it's going to be very interesting to see just kind of how this changes things like the Ohio State-Michigan game, or how teams and fan bases and coaches' jobs are all viewed when you can lose a game or two and still be involved, or be in the mix, at least the conversation for the playoff at the end of the year, and potentially winning a national championship.
The last time they miss a 12-team playoff, Pat, other than the Luke Fickell interim coach year, is 2004.
Yep, that makes sense. Yeah,
so
it's been a while.
That's making the playoff 17 or 18 years in a row.
Yeah, and I think there's going to be a handful of programs that feel like Ohio State coming into the year every year, Alabama, Georgia, who the programs are, that will expect to be in that playoff, and can probably afford a loss or two. And I mean, you can't lose to a directional school in the non-conference and expect to still get in, maybe. But if you handle your business for the most part, you're going to have a shot at the end of the year. And it's going to be much more NFL-like, where you build throughout the season. You want to be playing your best football at the end of the year, which they say now anyway, but you really will, because it's going to be more similar to what the NFL has. And how often in the NFL, or in any sport that has especially one game playoffs, do you see the best team win? It doesn't happen all the time. And I think you'll start to see that more as with this expanded playoff.
10-2 is going to be a slam dunk for the 12-team playoff. 9-3 is going to be more like if you have an extremely impressive out-of-conference win and the Big Ten's viewed as just a juggernaut, then it might push you over, but very few 9-3s are going to get in. It's 10-2 seems to be that pretty definite, solid entry point. Although, of course, with the 4 new entries from the Pac-12, and typically 2 of them being on the schedule, that does beef up the schedule and the potential for losses.
Good news for Penn State, I would say, because 10-2 seems to be right about where James Franklin's team has been. I think they probably would have been in most of these years as well. Yeah. And it's not just that, there will be a handful of teams that all of a sudden are more relevant in that conversation than they have been, just because of circumstances like that, where you're Penn State, you're in a division with 2 of the best teams in the country almost every year.
Yeah, they are the poster child. I don't think there's any question for this. Pat Murphy, Bucknuts 247 Sports. Get on over there. Check out Pat's work, football and basketball. And, of course, subscribe here at the Voice of College Football. Pat, always appreciate the breakdown.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Mark.